So thank you so much for that introduction and for the wonderful invitation to be here with Oldways and to share a bit of my research, which is a little bit of the macro behind the macro trends of how we think about consumers, what meaning they make of the foods that they're interested in and the way they come to the diets that they follow. So I wanted to start with a few of the questions that I want to think through with you today. The first being, what whole grains have meant to consumers in the United States across the 20th century and into the 21st. And to think through that, what the role of cultural context is in surrounding how that meaning came to be in the past and today. And to think about what historical influences are still with us in the way that we make meaning of how and why we should eat the way that we do. And I hope it will be helpful for those of you who are here of how this knowledge can help us to understand what it is that consumers want when they're choosing a whole grain product. So I want to start, oddly enough, with a social history of white bread. And so Aaron Burrows-Strain's really great social history tells the story of America's changing relationship to bread. And so he looks at it through a related set of dreams that change throughout the course of the 20th century. And so these sorts of paradigms are purity and contagion, control and abundance, health and discipline, strength and defense, peace and security, resistance and status. So why in the world would I tell you a white bread story at a whole grain conference? And so my point is to start us off with a few common understandings, that food isn't just food, or an ingredient, or a product. That even something like a single, simple, healthy, hearty whole grain is never just that when we think about it from a historical and cultural lens. So what I'm interested in working through is how food is a marker for identity, who we are and who we want to be, as well as the complex story that these individual foods can tell us about culture, about politics, and about so much more. So as a food studies researcher, we often talk about using food as a lens to be able to tell a lot of other different stories. So in a lot of ways, the food isn't even what I'm most interested in. It's everything else. So let me show you that story of everything else through whole grains. So we'll look at them throughout the course of the 20th century United States. So I'm not telling you a squeaky clean story of change over time. I'm zooming in and out to some key decades to look at some prominent themes and to think about what key parts of those contextual historical moments shape how we think about food today, particularly when it comes to foods like whole grains. So I want to start at the turn of our last century in thinking about how food was constructed as a uniquely modern fuel source. That this comes with the beginnings of modern nutrition science, of the research of folks like Wilbur Olin Atwater, that was thinking about the composition of food in a way that we hadn't known of it before. Early research on macronutrients, and I brought this great chart for you, which shows a variety of whole grains. This is from 1917, from Helen Atwater, who was Wilbur Atwater's daughter, and Caroline Hunt. So this is from How to Select Foods in 1917. So this is one of our very first nutritional education tools ever coming from the government. And so looking at how they're breaking down the components in each of these whole grains. And you can see how they're uniquely quantified. So when we think about what's the legacy from this moment of modern nutrition science emerging, the idea of thinking about food as calories, thinking about what we eat in terms of grams, that changed the way we thought about food in culture and in our lives in a profound way. That wasn't how we thought about food before. So thinking about how quantification in the discourse of science destabilizes some of the positions of heritage, of taste, of seasonality, of family, of ethnic heritage, this language of quantification and the legacy of science. This starts here at this last change of the century. And then the broader historical context in which that's happening are some of the biggest changes in American history, with industrialization, of dramatically changing the way we did work and labor, of immigration changing the population within our borders, and urbanization changing where we lived and how we related to the land and to processes of food production as we lived further and further from those sources of production. And so much of Atwater's early work was about creating modern, efficient, economical recommendations for the working poor of how they could stretch their food dollars as far as possible. But it was through this language of quantification rather than flavor or taste or foods that people would actually want to eat. So thinking about some of that legacy in nutrition, we can think about how that starts here. To move forward from the 10s all the way through the 40s is this notion of a cultural sense of vitamania. There was a cultural enthusiasm around vitamins when they were first discovered, coming out in the 10s, the 20s, the 30s, into the 40s. So the 20th century broadly is referred to as the golden age of nutrition science, when so many of these discoveries were made. And there was high public faith in what science had to offer. So when we think about vitamin deficiency diseases, treating them with the missing vitamin was like the magic bullet we'd been searching for. So the idea of understanding invisible vitamins existing in food and this profound power that they held shaped how the public thought about science and this great interest in nutrition that we see reflected in popular culture and across sort of the food moment at that time. But I wanted to point out that as early as the 1900s and the 1910s, there is this social anxiety about industrial food. From the moment we have refrigerated rail cars and we're able to transport food far away from the local food shed, there have been these individual and population level consumer concerns about what that meant, to have food produced on this large scale where you might not know the producer, where it might not be a part of this local community. So while so many in this room are thinking about how consumers today make sense of that kind of feeling, it's been with us a long time. It has ebbed and flowed in different ways. And so these are some of those origins. And then to think about this broad decade, section of time from the 10s to the 40s, we go through 2 world wars in this time. So thinking about how food configures into both a domestic and international policy and programming that was concerned for creating a productive workforce on the home front and an armed forces that was healthy and able to defend the nation in the international sense. And so that's where these ideas of vitamin donuts, right, providing pep and vigor, this understanding of vitamins having almost this magical quality comes from this historical moment, that they had this deep cultural resonance when they were first discovered. And so to zoom in on the 30s and 40s in particular as a time that was characterized in many ways by want and sacrifice. When we think about the foods that represented the Great Depression, we often think of bread lines and images like this of unemployed workers showing up for free donuts and coffee, that they are grain-based products that were handed out, that were a part of the food that was made available during these times. So as we think about bread from the cultural salience of the bread of life, the staff of life, to how it resonates in these moments of incredible economic want, that grains continue to be the food that's held up in that sort of metaphorical sense. And as we think about the rationing of World War II, again, this concern for productive workers on the home front, a healthy armed forces, as well as a sustained Allied presence. So wheatless Wednesdays had been a part of campaigns during these wars. And I'll point you to the second one to the last, right? Food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. You must now help to preserve it. That wheat is needed for the Allies. Of a moment where wheat production in the United States, its distribution on a global scale, and having these profound geopolitical influences in how that food was configured, in how we would win the war, and in how the United States would continue to develop its international reputation of the kind of people we were and the diplomacy that we would extend to other nations, resonating during this particular wartime. So after these decades of want and of sacrifice with rationing, the 50s and 60s emerges, Laura Shapiro calls it, a genuine feel-good era for food, a time of relative increasing affluence, where for the first time in decades, there was food available to eat, families able to gather around the dinner table together. But it's also a moment where we see a different kind of cuisine emerge called the convenience cuisine. And so part of this is related to the war, that it was an effort to find domestic markets for the products of the military-industrial complex, food like Spam, like instant coffee, like orange juice from concentrate, that had served their purpose during wartime and now had to find domestic markets for the companies that had invested in developing them. And so housewives, often considered the target market for these sorts of products, were actually really resistant to the idea, right? Rationing was finally over. You had normal production available. Why would I want to buy something in a package? And so it's a very interesting work through marketing and advertising from these various industries to create the glamorization of packaged food cuisine, that it was a big part of representing what a middle-class identity and sense of status would mean in this post-war period, marked by the significant changes of suburbanization, the kinds of spaces that we lived in, of automobile culture, the rise of supermarkets. We certainly had grocery stores for all of the 20th century, but to have supermarkets as your one-stop shop that was big and glossy and had automatic doors and everything was made of glass, it was the epitome of sort of the modernity of what the post-war period was going to look like. And then to think about how women are represented in these images as well, that many women, low-income women, women of color, had worked outside of the home for all of the 20th century. But this is a moment where we start to see a spike of middle-class women working outside of the home in greater numbers. And so thinking about how these social shifts of women moving into the public realm echo through the food culture, the kinds of products that are available, and the cultural meaning that they take on as a result. So if the 50s and 60s gives us convenience cuisine of packaged foods, the 60s and 70s gives us the food of the counterculture, which Warren Belasco calls the counter cuisine. And so in some ways, this was a food culture that was a resistance, a purposeful resistance to this convenience cuisine of the 50s and 60s. But it's also a reaction and a proposed solution to a host of colliding problems that were political, social, and environmental. When we think about the discourse of environmental crisis, when we think about the Vietnam War, we think about the assassinations happening in the 60s, we think about the trend of what had happened with the civil rights movement. This was a moment of big strife, of colliding problems. And so it's within this context that Belasco says the counterculture develops the language of the counter cuisine to push back against what they saw as the encroachment of industrial food, of processed food, which they viewed in a negative sense. And so this oppositional language that they employ maps in perfect ways onto how whole grains are conceived then and now, of natural versus plastic, of brown versus white, process versus processed, slow versus fast, and light versus heavy, as this language that they adopted. And so in addition to this sort of movement, there are also key texts that we can point to. When we think about the longevity of the Moosewood Cookbook and of vegetarian cooking, and Diet for a Small Planet being one of the first really influential texts to bring about this idea of not only meatless eating, but to call it high-protein meatless eating, to assuage the concerns that eating vegetarian or vegan wasn't going to give you enough protein. But this is still a moment when this way of eating, this way of thinking about the environment, of thinking about whole grains, of eating complementary proteins, is still a relatively fringe movement in comparison to where we are today, though the history of vegetarianism certainly stretches across the 20th century and into the 19th in really fascinating ways. But to think about the 80s and 90s, what Warren Belasco's history does is tells us the story of how some elements of the counter cuisine are modified and mainstreamed in really interesting ways. So much of what the counterculture was about was a different and deeper sense of health and one's relationship to the land and to food. That maybe you could fix some problems by changing the way that we eat. But what emerges in the 1980s is what Robert Crawford coined the term healthism. That health emerges as a super value of the American middle class, as something to fervently strive for. And that became so important that it was a way to mark the boundaries of one's class position and a way to mark unhealthy others who are often non-white and outside of the middle class boundaries. So thinking about the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion that came with the 80s and this sort of thinking of health. Which reverberates in interesting ways through the dietary guidelines emerging for the first time in the 80s and into the 90s as these government regulations about how to eat and how to conceive of the body in these new regulated senses. But also to have qualities like naturalness and the cultural longing baked in nostalgia to also carry on into these decades. And so one of the examples that's actually come up already at this conference that Warren Belasco writes about is that granola moves from being sort of a metaphorical representation of hippies, right, of literally being crunchy people, that granola becomes this commercialized product in granola bars, of looking at the transition of that food, how it's processed and how it comes to be a part of a different aspect of the food system, how it in some ways contains some of that original heart of the counterculture and the counter cuisine as it becomes a part of a mainstream food culture. So it's one example that he gives us to think through. So as I get to today and try to think about some of the themes that resonate for me when I think about the cultural resonance behind whole grains, there's three ways that I'm thinking through that. And so I definitely hear the message that saying that whole grains are healthy isn't this strong selling point for consumers. But if we think about health as an identity that has these aspirational components and that we know has been held up as a key way of defining who you are, particularly with a sense of status, that gives us a different way to think through health than just whether an ingredient is healthy or not. And to think about history as a nostalgic narrative that has cultural power, the idea that by eating ancient grains you're in some way connected to peoples of the past and from far away, the sense of connection that comes from the cultural power of nostalgia, right, of something that resonates deeply. And then to think about hope in a form of aspiration, the kinds of people that we want to be, but that I heard yesterday of the idea of the anxiety that also goes with that, of Andrea talking about not cooking with whole grains, right? Well, we're not whole grain people. Like, we can't live up to that lifestyle. But I'm interested in that dialectic of aspiration and anxiety and how they go together and how people are thinking about who they are and who they want to be. And so as we think about the context of our current moment, it actually reflects in very interesting ways to the collision of social, cultural, political, economic factors in the 60s and 70s, when we think about how our own time is and has been one of significant anxiety, conflict, and change. And so it's within those moments throughout history, we could go back many more decades, it's in these moments of big cultural anxiety and change that food emerges for eaters all the more powerfully as a way to negotiate who you are and who you wish you could be, and to propose food and the way that we eat, from production to consumption to waste, as a proposed solution to these larger problems that seem unsolvable. And so to relate this to some pop culture themes, I'm interested in thinking how food Instagram gives us a way to think through this contemporary food movement. And so some of the considerations here are this expansion of the centuries-old notion of you are what you eat, or at least what you post, that this engages a different understanding of how we represent who we are and what we're eating for public consumption and viewing. With my students, we talked about this notion of Instagrammability, right? That over deliciousness, or even edibility, that we will stand in line for a very long time to purchase something that will make the perfect Instagram photo, but might not even be edible because of all the things that are going on it. But you grammed it, and you were there, and you posted it, and it then reflects who you are. In thinking about what it means for a generation to live through their phones, to see the world through their phones, and to see it through social media like Instagram and its many filters, creates this notion of a curated existence rather than one that's a realistic representation. And so thinking about the scale at which one has to construct who you are to this level of performance versus an accurate representation of perhaps the ugly but delicious food you ate. I'm interested in what that does in how we perform who we are, and how it produces both social connection. There are certainly fascinating communities and relationships that sprout up through social media communities like Instagram, but they also produce isolation when one's sense of self-worth and definition comes from how many followers you have, how many likes you get, and how many comments, and the idea that having a food Instagram account or a blog is how you're going to get discovered. We talked about chefs, right? Going to school to get their big break to be on television instead of going in to actually be people who create food. That Instagram gives us this interesting dialectic of the amateur and the professional, and everyone aspiring for their big break in defining who they are through how they take pictures of food. So when I went and looked up a series of the thousands of photos that show up on hashtag whole grain, these are just a few of the kinds of photos that show up, right? Beautiful dishes, brightly lit, shot from overhead, with bright colors. And so I'm interested in how hashtags like whole grain going along with eat well give us this idea that amplifies this notion of you are what you eat to a completely different scale. And how additional hashtags like hashtag healthy, hashtag clean eating as aspirational practices, that they make even private eating in the home a public and demonstrated act that takes on this aspirational quality that's as much about identity as it is about a sense of health or of wanting to have the dish be hashtag healthy. And then I'm fascinated by hashtags like eat real food and hashtag real food, that eaters perceive whole grains as real, which I think matters. Foods with an honest history that's anthropological and archaeological and evolutionary, in a moment, in an age when so much feels unreal and fake and broken and untrustworthy. That within that cultural context, a real food like whole grains takes on this deep, resonant meaning for eaters who are finding that kind of meaning through the products that they're eating with. And then oddly enough, the paleo diet followers, while largely anti-whole grain, voice these similar cultural concerns as these whole grain devotees about the long-standing anxieties that we've just looked at across the entire 20th century about what modernity's potentially negative effects were going to be. So I'm interested in how these fears voiced by paleo diet followers about sedentary jobs and leisures, the proliferation of digital tech, the influence of industrial agriculture, which are real concerns, right, that we all might share, how these manifest as fears of a degenerating cultural vigor and strength. It's not just the individual body, but the cultural body that paleo diet followers are concerned about, that this degeneration and decline is expressed this idea of masculinity, muscularity, and individual achievement on a cultural scale. And so this has happened before. In this change of the last century, the physical culture movement was very concerned of what was going to happen, particularly to white male bodies as they shifted from rural work on land that they owned to an industrial context where they would go to work for someone else and have jobs where they were physically less active. It wasn't just a concern for the actual body, but the decline of the American nation that was made up of those bodies and how they made sense of themselves. So I see paleo diet actually mirroring, in a really direct sense, those previous concerns from 100 years ago of how we make sense of bodies in a modern context. So a few points I'd love to leave you with. The first is that our eating culture today retains key aspects of our eating past. So as we think about things like the nutritional language of quantification still being with us, as eaters make sense of how they're eating through calories, through grams of whole grain, through grams of fiber, et cetera, and how these wartime concerns for productive workers have shifted to an ongoing, never questioned emphasis on productivity in all aspects of our lives, not just during moments of crisis. And then this ongoing quest for status and a sense of self and identity through food, which we see peak and ebb at particularly profound cultural moments. To think about how our context, right, these various colliding moments shape food culture, that it's influenced by things like social shifts, whether they have to do with gender or race or class, influxes of new people, new policies, that's very much related to economic affluence or downturns. When we think about the effect of the Great Recession, the Great Depression, we can look at those kinds of connections. And then our various political moments. Right? We're in a moment of incredible division and conflict, and that shapes how and why people make sense through food as well. And then to end, that foods like whole grains are more than just what we eat, that they tell complex stories that we can acknowledge and promote in how these products make sense in different product lines within companies' priorities, that there is a cultural complex story behind why these products resonate with consumers.